Through the calendars, date stelae, monumental inscriptions, regnal lists, annals, and timekeeping systems from the ancient world all the way to today, there is a hidden calendar embedded into the structure of reality. Unbroken, perfect, found in the writings of our predecessors, mentioned by writers thousands of years ago. Every 138 years it brings changes to our world, edits, resets, and then disguises these changes under the guise of natural disasters. The Phoenix phenomenon causes mud floods, resets, mass vanishings, edits of history altering the trajectory of social and political events, introduces new materials, new translations to older text, strange phenomena. A small window of time in the month of May every 138 years when the veil between our world and somewhere else is rent open and there is an exchange of materials. At Archaix.com and the Archaix YouTube channel, you will find innumerous examples and data sets showing you that this strange overseer protocol has totally forged the unfolding of historical events and will return in May of 2040. Our world is not what you think. Listen, for over 200 years, artifacts, buried cities, underground relics, submerged forests, traditions of our ancestors, surviving texts of the old world, this combination of data from so many different sources resulted in an accepted worldview that the world was repeatedly destroyed. This was accepted by science, that there were cycles and epicycles in resets and cataclysms. The writings of Plato and Herodotus, Pliny, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Tacitus, Livy, I've read all these, I've cited them many times. Augustus, Arnobius, Ammianus Marcellinus, and there are so many others, but they left us whole descriptions of these terrific destructions. So Marcus Varro's another good one. So the history of the world, it was known to all, scientists and laymen, as a catastrophist model. There was no other opposing theories. It was understood the history of the world was one of earthquakes. Like Lucretius said, it was periodic destructions. And because Christianity and its ideals were in vogue, during this period of time, the idea and concept of God was often attached to these destructions. The 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, they were basically molded in part by these beliefs. Then the 18th century came around and scientists began entertaining new ideas. Uniformitarianism was a slow construction and one fraught with deception, manipulation, and outright lies. You guys remember Piltdown, man? That's just one of the frauds that they perpetuated to push evolution. So the development of the theories of natural selection and evolution of Lyell and Darwin, they contributed to a false interpretation of reality. And it's a major contributor to the Ice Age deception. Our story begins here. It begins in the Swiss Alps. It is the year 1744. So Pierre Martel, he's an engineer and geographer. He is living in Geneva. He reports that the inhabitants of the Alps attributed the dispersal of erratic boulders to glaciers. And basically he said that these glaciers that deposited these giant boulders in weird places all throughout the Swiss Alps, that they did this over different periods of time. This was a novel idea, but it explained, because in the Swiss Alps there are gigantic boulders that are out of place. They are made of different materials than the native rock. So in 1815, Jean-Pierre Pierrodin, but he explained erratic boulders in the Val de Bagnes in the Swiss canton of Valais as being due to glaciers previously extending further. He had believed that these glaciers extended in the past a lot further than they do today, but not all the way to the equator. And in 1818, the Swedish botanist Goran Waldenberg published his theory of a glaciation of the Scandinavian peninsula. But he regarded this glaciation as a regional phenomenon, not something that had happened worldwide. In the same year of 1818, a lake dammed by a glacier burst through, and geologists for the first time were able to see and research one of these things, and they learned quite a bit about the phenomenon itself. This underwater glacial lake had just built up from meltwater. It burst through, flooded a whole bunch of area, and it deposited loam and gravel and boulders, and they were able to see this firsthand, what it did in the Rhone Valley. And it made sense of all the weird geography they had seen all throughout the Rhone Valley and the Alps in Europe. So this gave rise to the first glaciologist. Glaciology began with, ironically, a disaster in 1818. Now, Jean de Charpentier, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, and a man named Ignaz Vennes. These guys in 1821 theorized that these glaciers were actually the things that were depositing these boulders further south from the North Pole. So in 1824, the Danish-Norwegian geologist, his name is Jens Esmark, he argued for a sequence of worldwide ice ages in a paper published in that year of 1824. Esmark proposed changes in climate as the cause of those glaciations. He attempted to show that they originated from changes in the Earth's orbit. Now, you have to understand, at this period of time, there were many scientists that proposed papers that were equally fascinating, but they were ignored by Scientifica because they promoted the catastrophist ideas and theory, that it was a comet, that there was some type of bolide, that there was maybe a solar flare, a great flood, major earthquakes, volcanism, anything that even promoted an idea that a natural disaster or a cataclysm occurred and that is the result of why the world is the way it is today was ignored at this time by the scientific community. But they promoted this guy because he was talking about climate change, which promotes uniformitarianism, the very slow processes by which our world was supposedly created. So in 1834, Charpentier, he submitted his glacial theory to a convention of scientists at Geneva, and the reaction was hostile instantly. This is the scientific community. These glaciologists, they hit a wall. So, and he was also met with derision and scorn. He remained steadfast, though, but he challenged the scientific community. All his critics, he said, okay, why don't you come out here to these sites and come see what I'm talking about? I will show you what I'm talking about. And somebody took him up on it. In 1835, 1 year later, Carl Schimper was studying mosses, which were growing on erratic boulders, and he had made some excursions into the Bavarian Alps and also saw some boulders, erratic boulders. Well, Schimper came to the conclusion that ice must have been the means of transport for the boulders to the Alpine uplands. So in 1835, Carl Schimper began a series of lectures explaining how glaciers carried rock debris, and in these dissertations he began theorizing that these cold episodes that formed glaciers must have been a global phenomenon. And so the following year in 1836, Schimper and Louis Agassiz took Charpentier's offer, his challenge, and they visited the sites for themselves, and he gave them a tour to see the glacial evidence that was cited 2 years earlier in Geneva. Agassiz took that research and the observations of Charpentier and Venetz and Schimper, and a theory was developed of a sequence of glaciations. But it wasn't Agassiz's theory. He took all this data from all his predecessors and the very men who showed it to him. And in 1837, early in the year, Schimper coined the term Ice Age. 1837, the term Ice Age was invented. Now, up until this time, no concept of Ice Age at all. The history of the world worked just fine according to the historical records. Ice Ages weren't needed to promote anything. But in 1837, Agassiz presented their synthesis before the annual meeting of a convention of scientists. This is 1837. The audience was very critical, and they even opposed the new theory because it contradicted the established opinions on climate history. Most of the contemporary scientists of the day thought that Earth had been gradually cooling since its birth as a molten globe. Rejected, Agassiz set out in the field to gather more evidence. He was going to get his own geological evidence, independent of the three men's data that he basically stole. In 1840, Louis Agassiz published all the research in his book, Studies on Glaciers. The book received some attention, and Charpentier was offended because he too was preparing a scientific book on glaciers, and it was he who introduced glaciology to Agassiz and shared with him his data. So to add insult to injury, Agassiz had omitted all references to Schimper as well, from whom he had received a lot of the information on glaciation. Louis Agassiz, who went on to basically to appropriate the ideas as his own, much to Schimper's and Charpentier's dismay, undeservedly received most of the credit for their origination. And here is where the matter lied for a quarter of a century. Glacial theory percolated, but it did not catch on. The idea of ice age was in the back of the scientific minds, but the theory did not advance because any promotion of ice age equally promoted a catastrophist model of history until the mid-1870s. In 1875, James Kroll published Climate and Time in their Geological Relations, which provided a credible explanation for the causes of ice ages that was totally in line with the new models of natural selection and evolution. His model explained that these ice ages happened over vast periods of time. Only now did the scientific community get on board. So, understand what's happening here. The scientific community didn't get on board because James Kroll provided new data. He provided a new interpretation of the old data, one that was in line with the direction the scientific community was trying to go. That's not science, but that's what we're told is exactly what happened. March 15th, in the year 2021, the University of Vermont scientists found frozen plant fossils preserved under a mile of ice in Greenland. Now, this was promoted as sensational. It was a sensationalist claim, but there's nothing sensational about it. It made a lot of headway, a lot of news, but this has been going on for a very long time. You just don't know about it because you're not buried in the old books. The discovery, it helps to confirm a new and troubling understanding that the Greenland ice sheet has melted entirely during recent warm periods in Earth's history. That a mass flash freeze happened is evidence in both hemispheres. Frozen flora and fauna in North America, Alaska, Siberia, the Arctic, they've all been excavated from the permafrost and below the ice. Guys, you can't make this up. Mammoths, bison, sloths all froze solid instantly, some of them with undigested plants still on their tongues. Some of them in the 1800s were being thawed out, and locals in Siberia were still eating the meat. Since 1910, fossils have been found in Antarctica. Recently, a petrified forest was found in Antarctica under the ice sheet. The island of Spitsbergen is in the Arctic Ocean. It's north of Norway. It is 12 degrees south of the North Pole. Fossils of tropical fruits have been found in coal deposits at Spitsbergen. Listen, Spitsbergen, 12 degrees away from the North Pole, and yet under the ice are 95 species of trees, including yews, hazels, elders, beech, lime trees, magnolia, and others. There were 11 species of palm trees under the ice just south of that in Switzerland. And swamp cypress, tulip trees, liquid amber, sweet gum, fig trees, cinnamon trees, and fruit trees of the cherry, plum, and almond species, all under the ice. In Spitsbergen are willows that are only found in southern Europe, 12 degrees away from the North Pole. This data is in the 1885 book, The Prehistoric World, Vanished Races by E.A. Allen, but he's only citing an earlier archaeological research book published. Over 900 pages of scientific data was published in what's called the Manual of Geology that was compiled by James Dana, 1800s. Listen, the Miocene, the Eocene, the Holocene, the Pleistocene, the Dryas, the Younger Dryas, these are all fictions created by scientists as new data sets are accepted as true, but the information doesn't comport with the accepted model. So a new period was added. This is how they put all these together. And thus the chronology is expanded to even further back in history. And every bit of it, the scientists love it because it helps promote natural selection and evolution. A massive amount of research, discoveries, fossils, excavations, reports, books, all having been filtered through the uniformitarian view of history. Meaning that the data had to be interpreted and presented as if it takes hundreds of thousands and millions of years for Earth changes to occur. But then, every bit of it could be abbreviated to a very short period of time if we didn't use that uniformitarian filter. The collapse of the vapor canopy not only produces the necessary humidity needed in the polar extremities for the abundant snowfall, but it was all at once, meaning the collapse of the watery mesosphere created the ice caps almost instantly when the world froze. When the megafauna, giant bison, mammoths, huge sloths, the marsupials, vast forests of the Antarctic and Arctic, they were all rapidly buried under thousands of feet of snow, frozen solid. The moisture of the mesosphere became the snows of the ice cap. Once the vapor canopy was gone, the sun ruled the sky. The necessary humidity in the polar regions was no longer present. Most of the canopy now frozen in packed ice from the weight of the accruing snow. Within a century, the Arctic and Antarctic then enjoyed only 2 to 3 inches of snow every year. And this tiny amount of snowfall seen by scientists today, who are trained to think only in the uniformitarian terms, makes them push back the ice ages to impossible dates far beyond when they actually happened. Because they refuse to entertain the catastrophist model that shows that these ice caps could have been formed in weeks or months, not 10,000 years, we get the bogus theories of ice ages in the Miocene, Eocene, and the Pleistocene, and the Dryas. The average thickness of the Antarctic ice cap is 1.34 miles. But for simple math, we'll say 1.5 miles. We'll give it some. 1.5 miles. That's 7,920 feet. This is 95,045 inches. At an inch a day of snowfall, just 1 inch a day of snowfall, this would have taken 260 years to reach 1.5 miles. That's not 10,000 years. That's just 260 years. But you also have to note, there is no snowfall in Antarctica today more than 2 inches a year because it's too cold. And cold air doesn't hold moisture. This isn't Jason telling you this. Any scientific book will tell you why there are so many anomalies about the Arctic and Antarctica. How the ice caps were formed is one of the greatest controversies of science that laymen don't even know is raging in Scientifica. Let me explain. This is the danger of uniformitarianism, to claim that the 2 inches of snowfall today is the way that it has always been. The belief that the snowfall has been consistent with 10,000 years has also corrupted the interpretation of the ice core data. Their models are uniformitarian, so their conclusions are that long periods had passed. Scientists abhor a knowledge vacuum. This means that they will promote any theory or model of history that advances uniformitarianism as long as the catastrophist model is ignored and never taken seriously. It is my opinion that the criticism and resistance Graham Hancock has suffered recently with his Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse is because of two items that uniformitarians stringently oppose. Hancock and his followers are of the opinion that the scientific community is so opposed to the idea of an advanced civilization in the Ice Age, but that's not their true issue. By dating this civilization at the Younger Dryas, Hancock has brought worldwide attention to a period that scientists have really tried to pass off as fact without having their data reviewed upon closer scrutiny. You see, what is not popularly known is that there are over 60 different theories as to how ice ages could even be possible. It's a fact that the issue is one that has never been agreed upon by all of academia. Yeah, there have been many scientific papers, and they're diabolically opposed to each other. Because older temperatures are less able to hold water vapor, the amount of rain or snow would be reduced, not increased. This single fact has been a real problem for Ice Age theory. When a phenomenon cannot be explained by existing data, the theories multiply. This is what has happened with the Ice Age idea. The 60-plus theories that have been published as to the cause of the ice ages actually serves a nefarious purpose. The focus has shifted from, hey, you guys still haven't made your case for the ice ages, to the modern, hey, you guys still can't figure out how the ice ages happened? The latter is designed to infer that ice ages are absolute truth and only their causes are unknown. The other great threat to the official model that Hancock has brought attention to is the idea that it was a cataclysm that ended this period of the Ice Age, which brings against the long-censored catastrophist interpretation of the data sets that we have been told only lead to uniformitarian chronology. Graham Hancock's proposition calls into question all over again what took establishment scientists a century to bury. The fact that the catastrophist model actually does answer all the data sets and that uniformitarianism is a false interpretation of history. The evidence of this is that there are 60 different theories as to why or how ice ages could happen. But in catastrophist model, only one theory exists, and it's the right one. All promote the ice ages, but they are widely variant in their beliefs as to how these were even possible. And this is because the humidity conditions at the poles required to create the ice caps could never have happened because of worldwide cooling. Let me repeat this. Scientists assert that the world cooling would not create ice caps because the colder temperatures does away with the requisite humidity. It requires immense humidity to create the snowfall necessary to build up the ice caps. And the collapse of the vapor canopy in 2239 BC answers for this mystery. And what this means for you and the Archaix research is that an ice age is certainly possible, but it was within the last 5,000 years, and the mechanism for its inception was the collapse of the vapor canopy. It was the day the sky fell. You know this as the Great Flood. Another indicator that the ice caps we have today are relatively new is the existence of the Oronce Finet's 1534 world map that shows an ice-free Antarctica. And of course the more famous Piri Reis map, the Turkish navigator, depicted in Charles Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Two ancient maps showing Antarctica free of ice. This means that within the last 2,000 years or so, someone had navigated and explored the region and mapped it out when there were no ice sheets to impede them. So how is this possible? Actually, it's simple. In 2239 BC, the vapor canopy collapsed and provided us ice caps from the abundant water vapor turned snow. Over a few thousand years, glaciation deposited boulders and topsoils further from the poles, and the ice caps almost disappeared, allowing for navigation and cartography. Then, in 522 AD, the Phoenix phenomenon returned, and there was a 25-year darkness. The sun dimmed, and a new vapor canopy formed. But it didn't stay. It almost instantly collapsed after a quarter of a century, and this again provided the necessary humidity to again bury the poles in snow. Only the catastrophist model answers for the enigmas and data sets, and Graham Hancock has inadvertently drawn attention back to a major hole in scientific theory. It's the fictitious Younger Dryas period. I have many problems with Graham Hancock's chronological dating of different things, and especially using the Atlantis narrative to promote a 9,500 or 10,000 BC civilization. But outside of that, I do agree with him in many aspects of his research.
Imagine a scenario where the hidden elite have built immense underground facilities. Powered by petroleum products they can acquire endlessly from subterranean coal seams and drilling. All infrastructure being run on electricity by fossil fuels. Now, do underground cities exist? Yes. Can fossil fuels be easily obtained without emerging to the surface? Yes. Can fossil fuels provide power to generate electricity? Yes. Now imagine a scenario where think tanks funded by these hidden elites spent years analyzing the world's secretly preserved ancient and historical texts. Every recorded event is entered into the program. Data from lost texts, books taken by agents of the elite, authors killed and made to disappear. These think tanks with this data run simulations and projections from different historical periods and discover that in the near future an event will take place that is unstoppable. They discover the return of the vapor canopy, the Phoenix. This induces a deeper study, more think tanks, an assessment of the tens of thousands of archaeological findings that never made it to the public arena. The elite discover that the canopy alters human DNA, allowing for rapid healing, longer lives, holding the breath for long periods of time. The canopy produces a world without rain, but very humid. A mist that will water the surface every evening and morning. The sun will vanish in the dark violet sky by day, but at night the canopy is clear, magnifying both the moon and the stars. Under this thick mesosphere, there is no wind, and oxygen density is more than 60% what it is today. Now imagine the elite begin preparing to reestablish their dominance over a post-cataclysmic world full of people who suffer the loss of their infrastructures. Some cities are still untouched, but by that event date, they have been corralled by the elite into going 100% solar. But the canopy blocks this light. They rely on their wind turbines, but the new sky is still and heavy. They change over their transportation to electric, but the fossil fuel industry is ruined and cannot produce generators for power. Now imagine that the elite have been having their bodies frozen in cryo chambers to be revived at a future time when DNA will respond different to different stimuli. And imagine mountainsides opening their titanium blast doors to unleash armored divisions of super soldiers equipped with gear and weaponry specifically designed for this vapor canopy world. Tanks, APCs, helos, drones, aircraft, all still perfectly operable using the very fossil fuels the elite brainwashed the rulers of nations into believing was destroying the earth. Imagine that I'm describing the world just just years before the Great Lithospheric Displacement Event of 3895 BC. The pole shift of the Phoenix phenomenon that reset a powerfully advanced civilization so abruptly that the survivors regarded the very next year as year one of a whole new world. The pole shift I'm talking about was year one of the pre-flood world, the 1656 years in Genesis, which began when God told mankind to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, to fill it again.
So guys, the story of the Sumerians and their beliefs about the Anuna is critical to our understanding of what is unfolding today. When we remove the primitive frames of reference, the childlike descriptions, and we analyze the core common denominators left to us in these astounding ancient cuneiform documents, well, we're left with the description of a vast catastrophe that was predicted, and the vanishing of an advanced population that departed so they could survive it. We are left with the reappearance of these godlike bearded people who, after this disaster, resurfaced in two ways: from under a mountain and in fleets of ships from across the sea. Because the Anunnaki were called the children of Anu, the later Babylonians misinterpreted the originals in very old records of the Sumerians concerning when they were called by the logogram Anunnaki. This is Anuna of earth. For there is no evidence that the word none, which Zechariah Sitchin and many of his ilk follow, ever meant heaven. This was merely traditional etymology leading the later Babylonian scribes to interpret the epithet of Anunnaki as offspring of heaven and earth, but that was never its original intent. I'm going to tell you what Nun meant and what it was a part of in the belief system, the older Sumerians. Sitchin touches upon it, but he just leaves it alone. So the Sumerian, it just didn't convey this meaning at all. The Sumerian word Nun is synonymous with Apsu, the underworld, a common title used in many names. Apsu literally means the deep, as in, basically as in the place in Sumerian records, an Anunnaki city called Nunkaiga, which means the city of the deep. It was recognized that the Anunnaki had an underworld city. Yeah, that is a game changer. The Sumerian underworld was thought to be filled with water, the fountains of the deep, and the idea and etymology can be traced back to Sanskrit as well, where we learn that the root ap in Apsu, the Babylonian Apsu, is in Sanskrit the word for water. It's the very earliest records that held that the Anunnaki came from the deep. And they weren't even called Anunnaki. That's the later Babylonians doing that. They were called the Anuna. The exact history of the Anuna is playing out today. The technologically advanced rulers and their families of various governments they're preparing underworld cities and manufacturing districts, whole subterranean oil refineries and food, weapons depots. This is all being done in preparation for the next big cataclysm. And they know when it is. They're not stupid. I didn't just find all this material over the years. I believe that many among the elite have never lost it. It's May 2040. In November 2046. I believe they'll ride the whole 6.5-year period out underground. So, the Anuna had emerged from this underworld city in ancient times. This is the story of the Anunnaki. This is why Zechariah Sitchin's focus was in trying to convince the world in his Earth Chronicle series that the Anunnaki were from space. This is why his research and travels were funded by globalist elitists. This is why the media promotes the space race narrative perpetuated by the elitist organizations like NASA and SpaceX. This is why platforms like YouTube and others push channels and content creators who promote the ideas of space being an option for colonization. It's all smoke and mirrors. Everything is designed for you to keep looking up until you see the actual appearance of the Phoenix. And it's not going to be real soon. We have 18 more years before it comes. And you have to understand, Neptune and Uranus are gigantic planets, and they're in our own solar system, and you can't see them with the naked eye. They're too far out there. So you have to apply that same logic. We're not going to see Phoenix until it's almost too late. By that time, every underground facility will be sealed and packed with provisions and all the elements of infrastructure so these people can ride out the storm that will be unleashed upon the surface. My friends, we have 18 more years, but they are going to preoccupy us with smoke and mirrors and bread and circuses long before then. Almost instantly after a series of military science operations in the 1950s and 60s following World War II, the U.S. military and the Western powers began excavating down and building secret underground facilities, districts, and whole cities networked together in thousands of miles of tunnels. After the World Wars, the international scientific communities of the military-industrial complex were making major discoveries about our world and history that led to the creation of public-funded organizations that pretended to spend the money on space exploration, while actually funding the construction of this new subterranean infrastructure. Such a massive deception perpetuated against the public, taxpayers, and even the lower-level employees of these public space corporations was aided by the complicit mainstream media giants and continues today under the front of NASA, SpaceX, and other space-related companies. The level of deception required the aid of intelligence agencies, and the actual truth was only revealed at the time to those with the highest levels of security clearances. Many whistleblowers who have reported this, like William Cooper and Phil Schneider, have lost their lives for informing the public about what they found. Sad. But the real mystery is not how they remained secret for so long, nor how they successfully perpetuated the hoax of NASA and the totally comical lunar landing fiction. No, the genuine mystery here is the why of all the urgency. What did the military scientists in the 1950s learn about our world that induced them this worldwide massive program of construction and the immense misdirection campaigns enacted to keep the public at large from knowing? What advantage do they seek in housing a few million people in underground facilities? The answer is in old books. They have discovered the Phoenix phenomenon, and we know today that prior civilizations also built underground Phoenix fallout facilities. We know this because we have found many of them. In China, there are the famous Longyu caves, also called the stone chambers, 24 artificial stone caverns for which the Chinese admit to having no historical records that mention them. These were only recently discovered in 1992, and the average floor of the caverns is 11,000 square feet, with heights. The ceiling is 98 feet tall in these caverns. These astounding underground caverns built by men in unrecorded history seem to have had an engineering purpose that has escaped us today. They are technical in design, and what is truly profound is that for ages, the large hill these subterranean constructions were found underneath has always in China been called Phoenix Mountain. And another mystery: in the Grand Canyon, thousands of caves and ancient mines have been found. This is a photo of the entrance to Stanton's Cave. When it was first explored, it was determined to be a man-made construction and had obviously vaulted ceilings, and authorities later installed a massive iron bar wall to prevent exploration. In excavations in 1969 and 1970, several artifacts were removed from this cave. Much of the Grand Canyon has been turned into national parks and has forbidden zones that are off limits to the public. This stems from an incident in 1909 that the government tried to keep from public disclosure. A newspaper not known for printing hyperbole or fiction, the Phoenix Gazette, in 1909 reported that two Smithsonian archaeologists discovered an underground facility in the Grand Canyon that had vast galleries of rock, immense chambers, was vast in expanse, and contained Egyptian-like artifacts. These men were Professor Jordan and archaeologist Kincaid, both longtime employees of the Smithsonian. The engine of censorship went into full swing, and the American public forgot the discovery after 1912 until David Hatcher Childress, in his book Lost Cities of North America, published in 1993, ignited a firestorm of public interest. Instantly, the Smithsonian Institution officially published that the article was not true because a Professor Jordan and an archaeologist named Kincaid had not been in the employment of the institution. They asserted they searched for files and they found nothing. The Smithsonian Institution went on record publicly saying that these two men had never worked for the institution. This amazing article right here demonstrates the value of the Archaix approach. For a researcher in the year 2014 actually looked in old Smithsonian books published in the 1880s all the way to 1910s, and he found that both Professor Jordan and archaeologist Kincaid had definitely been employed with the Smithsonian, and for over 20 years. They had published multiple papers and had been involved in multiple excavations. Another researcher found this photo right here in the Smithsonian archives. Here's one of the two men. The irony that this was the Phoenix Gazette does not escape me, but what should not escape you is that this lie has been exposed, and this means that these men found in the Grand Canyon, what they claim they found in the Grand Canyon, was indeed exactly what they said, an underground city. In the first year of excavations building a mega metropolis under Cheyenne Mountain in the United States, on the other side of the world in Cappadocia in Turkey, a man accidentally found the underground city of Derinkuyu. It was explored and found to be 18 stories down, and it could have housed 20,000 people with all their livestock. Cisterns, wells, advanced air shafts, tunnels that led in all different directions to other underground facilities. 58 more have already been found under Turkey, all connected to Derinkuyu. So, this is no light statement that 59 ancient underground cities have been found in this one area of the world, and that there are no mentions of these places in the historical record. A population a long time ago had found a need to hide from something expected on the surface. Even if the others didn't hold as many as Derinkuyu, the combined population underground in these 59 cities would still have been at least 1 million people. The immense amount of labor required to have excavated these cities would have required an infrastructure more sophisticated than we give the ancients credit for, and a knowledge of cycles and epicycles which infers that they were already aware of a rich and measurable historical period known to themselves of these destructions. Said another way, these were built in another age for which we have no memory, but built by a people who had a very long memory, and they knew what was coming. Our takeaway here: civilizations don't suddenly start draining their economies in the secret construction of underground infrastructures for no reason.
In discussing old books, old text, let's defer to the authority of an old book. This book here is an original from 1853. I got to be very careful with it. This is the complete works of Thomas Dick. Now, however, this is 1853 when his materials were compiled. His writings are older than this. This book is absolutely packed with references to many historic writers, to many newspapers, periodicals, journals, scientific reports from the 16th and 17th and 18th century. Mentions many ancient writers. It's just, the book is packed. The print is so tiny, double column like the Bible. This book is massive. The data it contains is fantastic for 1853. This is basically a pre 20th century reset book. So let's go ahead and defer to the authority of an old book about how rare and how precious old books really are. So I'm going to read to you just a single passage from this book. All right. On page 132, one of the causes of the universal ignorance which prevailed during the Dark Ages was the scarcity of books, along with their exorbitant price and the difficulty of rendering them into more common means. The Romans wrote their books either on parchment or on paper made of Egyptian papyrus. The latter, being the cheapest, was of course the most commonly used. But after the communication between Europe and Egypt was broken off on account of the latter having been seized upon by the Saracens, the papyrus was no longer in use in Italy and other European countries. They were obliged, on that account, to write all their books upon parchment, and as the price of parchment was very high, books became extremely rare and of great value. We may judge of the scarcity of the materials for writing them from one circumstance. There still remain several manuscripts of the 8th, 9th, and following centuries written on parchment. Now, he said this in 1853. There still remain several manuscripts of the 8th, 9th, and following centuries written on parchment, from which some former writing had been erased, in order to substitute a new composition in its place. In this manner, it is probable that several works of the ancients perished. A book of Livy or of Tacitus might be erased to make room for the legendary tale of a Catholic saint, or the superstitious prayers of a missal. Many circumstances prove the scarcity of books during these ages. Private persons seldom possessed any books whatsoever. Even monasteries of considerable note had only one book in their possession. This is very, very intriguing. Very intriguing at all. The price of books became so high that persons of moderate fortune could not afford to purchase them. The Countess of Anjou paid for a copy of the homilies 200 sheep, 500 quarters of wheat, and the same quantity of rye and millet. Even so late as the year 1471, when King Louis XI borrowed the works of Rhasis, the Arabian physician, from the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, he not only deposited in pledge a considerable quantity of plate, but was obliged to procure a nobleman to join with him as surety in a deed, binding himself under great forfeiture to restore it. Basically, he had to produce a human of noble blood to go basically to as a exchange and surety for the value of the book. That's crazy, but this is what they're recording. In the 11th century, the art of making paper in the manner that has now become universal was invented, by means of which not only the number of manuscripts increased, but the study of the sciences was wonderfully facilitated. Now, I only mention that to illustrate the point that this is a very old book from 1853, which is a collection of writings of a man who wrote even prior to that, who is citing many historical books even before that, writing about times even before that. The chain of custody for old and ancient writings just doesn't exist anymore. We have references and many books cross-reference each other, but what I'm about to show in this video is we cannot judge a book by its cover. We cannot assess the value of a text basically on a rumor that it's either new or not. Every single text that comes into our possession either stands or falls on its own merit. It is the content of a text by which we derive value, or we judge that it is spurious. That is the subject matter of this video, but I'm going to reveal some very profound stuff. Those of you that have followed my research, you already know that every 138 years, things are suddenly introduced into the public domain. Such a prolific amount of concepts, inventions, orders, companies, and texts is beyond coincidence and denotes the operation of something we have hitherto not considered. To follow my reasoning to a most astonishing conclusion, please understand the following assertions. 1. There are many researchers today who believe that all history books are forgeries. For purposes of this demonstration, I agree with them. 2. Some hold that many discoveries of old books and texts are actually staged and that the writings are modern. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Egyptian Nag Hammadi text, both discovered in 1946 and 47. For purposes of this demonstration, I agree with them. 3. 1947 was also a staged event, very popular in UFO culture, the alien assist of Roswell, where the public was led to believe that a crashed UFO in New Mexico brought the US government new technologies. 4. Academia today has favored text, and these are accepted as genuine. In these writings can be found almost nothing of value on the Phoenix phenomenon. Nothing. 5. The text academia does not accept as genuine have a common denominator. The Book of Jasher, the Colburn Bible, the Ora Lind manuscript of the Dutch, the prophetic poem of Mother Shipton, and the Centuries of Nostradamus. And there are other texts that I've mentioned in my videos. These texts all have the Phoenix phenomenon as a common denominator. 6. The Archaix research has isolated a single series of numbers cited in numerous texts purported to be of ancient or more contemporary provenance. These texts all mention spans of time that involve resets and mud floods and great devastations. And all these spans of time are curiously divisible by 138. Now, numerous data sets have been published showing a hidden corpus of knowledge threaded through all of these texts. All of these periods are said to be the duration between two cataclysms. To find they are all divisible by 138 is beyond coincidence. 7. My studies, as published in my books and my videos, demonstrate for all that there are definitive mathematical patterns all through the matrix of events that we call history, that they are too perfect and therefore denote artificial construct. The exact same patterns are paralleled in the rectilinear dimensions of the scientific measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza and in no other pyramid. I have now listed these 7 things in order for you to consider. Having studied hundreds of historic translations of purportedly ancient writings and found the depth and interconnectedness of so many concepts, histories, chronographical materials, transcontinental parallels in belief systems, timekeeping systems, and so much else, I can never agree with those researchers who maintain positions number 1 and number 2 above. However, I admit that they are absolutely correct. But this is not a paradox. That I believe these texts are both forgeries and also genuine. These positions are not opposites. We are confronted here with a mystery that requires more than two-dimensional thinking. There is one explanation that satisfies all of the conflicting facts in items 1 through 7 that I just read. An explanation that has nothing to do with simulation theory and everything to do with the Phoenix phenomenon. An explanation that actually bridges together the discoveries of many truthers all over the world. You see, we have been looking at this series of events the wrong way. Our vantage point was governed by how we have been led to believe through alternative media that all the elite are wicked. But we have a benefactor, and that figure must have control over a multitude of agents. 1902 is what gave it away. As soon as the Phoenix phenomenon was past, the elite came out of hiding and introduced all their new companies, corporations, banks, institutes, organizations, inventions, concepts, engineering, and the list continues. My videos on 1902 need be referenced if you have no clue what I'm talking about. But also were books, texts, translations. Someone thought it necessary to benefit the world with knowledge. But the introduced books, they're not forgeries. These were kept in a safe place, just as the inventions and the records. All the seemingly new companies protected away from the Phoenix destruction. This is no coincidence. These weren't forgeries, they were copies of protected texts that someone preserved from earlier Phoenix destructions. This means suddenly appearing new books and texts in 1902 and 1903, as well as in 1764 and 1765, 1626 and 1627, and 138 years earlier in 1488 and 1489, were actually preserved underground with the elite to keep them from being destroyed. These are copies of important records to mankind, and different underground fallout facilities would have copies of the same books and texts the other facilities had in their repositories, because there is no guarantee that each holdout facility will survive. The old text preserved as newer copies brought up from the underworld after each Phoenix event answers for us the mystery as to how all these ancient writings are both forgeries and actual copies of real and important events. The elite rule from the underworld. The libraries of the underworld are leaked to the surface, disguised as more ancient writings because they were at one time, before being copied, actual ancient writings. This is done in the same way that a museum preserves copies of relics and texts that they put on display in multiple cities at the same time. The 138-year Phoenix timeline and phenomenon was put together from a massive corpus of texts from all time periods translated from many different languages. Therefore, I must conclude that someone wanted us to have this data, that these controlled leaks of text are from a benefactor group, that the discovery of the Phoenix phenomenon was intended. And by extension, because all of the 138-year periods are found in the scientific measurements of the Great Pyramid, then it was further intended that we make the connection between the Phoenix and the Giza superstructures. There is no cause to waste energy debating guys who claim the ancient texts are all forgeries, because in essence they are correct. But in being correct, they have isolated themselves away from the deeper reality being unveiled today. Just because something isn't an original copy does not mean it does not contain an original message. The elite have fed us a vision of the immensity of the above-ground archives of the Vatican vaults, but the truth is that the benefactor from the underworld has routinely shared his own library with us. Truthers are becoming the new fundamentalists, closing their minds to everything that doesn't fit their model of interpretation. The evidence is clear. Thousands of texts are being preserved from generation to generation by an order of people who have not been given credit for this operation, who remain in the shadows, who have saved the writings of the ancients and continually make them accessible to us today, because if they didn't do this, we wouldn't have access to them. There have been too many destructive resets, too many mud floods, too many book burnings, and natural disasters. No theory of the origin of a text should ever taint its interpretation. Every writing stands or falls on its own merit. An unbiased researcher will assess the value of a text by its content, not the theories attached to its appearance or origin. That's all distraction. The whole history is fake assertion made by those who have they've gotten bogged down in the details and they just can't see any farther. And those claiming all texts are forged, they stunt their own growth because they can't see the forest for the trees. Isolating one fact that something is a copy does not in any way reflect upon its contents. The Alexandrian library was full of copies of older texts. It's called a library, and books go through many editions. There are two forces at play here. They come from two distinct backgrounds. They have been at war with each other for thousands of years. One group in 1945 released the Nag Hammadi Codices, the texts of the Gnosis. In them is mentioned the Phoenix and its function to keep the archons in check. This corpus of texts is from a benefactor group. The other group, not the benefactor group, released the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1946 and 47, which is their own version of the war that began a long time ago. This archive is the version of the enemy. The former texts are spiritual and convey the world as being influenced by intelligences, reality being a construct controlled by the demiurge. The latter collection is steeped in religiosity, materialism, a falsified version of spirituality dependent on blind obedience and submission. Both collections of texts came from the underworld. Just as in 1902, so did air conditioning and a whole list of inventions, products, and concepts that we take for granted today. This is because when the elite emerge from back out of their fallout facilities, they bring everything of importance with them. We have been looking at this the entire wrong way. I am no longer convinced that the entire world is evil and against us. I do believe that we are being closely monitored. The Phoenix object was named in antiquity, studied by the ancients, feared by kings, and it was understood in the earliest times that it was to take down the power of the archons. These archons were they who ruled over the world using human lackeys. Over the years, I found the disastrous episodes afflicted our world, and these visitations were patterned in 138-year periods and in multiples of 138. I found that monuments from the old world recorded this 138-year patterning, that ancient traditions claim that the angel of death appeared every 138 years. The Genesis record of the pre-flood world was in multiples of 138. Many early timekeeping systems preserve this 138-year reckoning. The annals and accounts of so many very old chronicles, they comported with the exact dates archaeologists were claiming that whole regions were visited with ruin. Over and over, I found references to these destructions as always happening in the month of May. I copied the sources because I had not dated a single event, but I had pulled these dates and the conclusions from the writings of those who had published their findings, but writers who didn't know anything about the Phoenix, or that what they had documented was a part of a much vaster apparatus. For years, I followed the hints in mystic, esoteric, hermetic, rabbinical literature, just old books, of a connection between the Great Pyramid of Egypt and the Phoenix traditions. One day,
when I was studying the scientifically precise measurements of the pyramid at Giza by Sir Flinders Petrie, I found that link. Chambers, angles, planes, ascending slopes, passages, descending tunnels, antechambers, vertical ceiling heights, floor widths, sloping distances. It was all there and patterned in units of 138 and all its multiples, right there in the rectilinear dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza. In the thousands of books and videos on the Great Pyramid that you can see on YouTube and other venues in libraries, no one has ever revealed that the entire structure is patterned in hundreds of rectilinear links, all involving measurements of the number 138 and its multiples, like 276, 414, 552, 690. Those are all divisible by 138. Pursuing this research, a suspicion began building in my mind that perhaps this superstructure from the ancient world was not only recording the past and future of all the Phoenix visitations, but maybe other historical events as well. I pulled out my meticulous chronicon. So this took over 2 years because what I found was a magnificent three-dimensional calendar of the history and future of our world in stone, which led to my next shock. In assessing all of this data, I had to compare the Phoenix chronology with that of the Mayan long count, the secular histories, the Vedic yugas, the Sumerian king list, the biblical chronology, and the appearances of the Nemesis X object. I overlaid these timelines over each other on a poster into one synthetic timeline and future of our world, and then found it replicated in the measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The template of events unveils exactly what will occur on May 2040, then November 2046, then in 2106 AD, followed by the collapse of all of these systems in the year 2178 AD. But this entire series of discoveries, though they support each other perfectly, propose a real problem. I am unable to synchronize two entirely separate series of facts. 1. The Phoenix timeline of 138-year period spanning 5,500 years of recorded history is supported by an extensive bibliography provided by others who provided the date and yet had no knowledge of the Phoenix. 2. The Phoenix always appeared in May. 3. The Phoenix mathematics is preserved in stone in the Great Pyramid and is absolutely irrefutable. It is an unassailable thesis. Anybody can compare that math. But these facts are in total defiance of our Newtonian mechanics. No object in the solar system can maintain such precision over so lengthy a span. Our Earth's own velocity changes. Obliquity is a factor in acceleration and deceleration. Solar activity affects orbital movement. Past pole shifts and cataclysms would have affected Earth's velocity. But then there is the real nail in the coffin. I have produced at least 30 different historic sources showing that all the calendrical systems in the ancient world were based off of a 360-day calendar. And I'm not the first to publish this. Immanuel Velikovsky and others before him did so too. Then later toward the 8th century BC, our orbit around Sol increased by 5.25 days a year to a new calendar year of 365.25 days, the one we have today. I have produced in books and videos over 14 different sources, maybe 15 sources, 16 sources that claim that at the time, different civilizations all changed their calendars. Thus, Phoenix would have appeared in May during the 360-day year. But after the change to 365.25 days, then Phoenix would have begun falling out of sync and appear in the month of April. Then later, Phoenix would start appearing in the month of March. But that never happened. So I was confronted with a paradox, a very intriguing enigma that ate at my soul for a year or two. Everything I had uncovered and documented was true. Yes, there is a 138-year Phoenix timeline. Yes, it appears in May. Yes, its appearances were documented and dated by other authors, not me. Yes, this 138-year timeline is coded in the measurements of the Great Pyramid. Yes, Phoenix appeared in May of 1764 and was observed by astronomer Hoffman. and about 500,000 people in Europe. And yes, Phoenix appeared in the month of May in 1902, and I have 3 videos about it. Yes, the ancient year was 360 days. Yes, the modern year has been for over 26 centuries now, 365.25 days. Yes, under the Newtonian order of planetary dynamics, this series of facts that I just itemized for you is absolutely impossible. So, if every conclusion is a result of a long series of facts, and each fact supports all the others, then I was left to reconcile this paradox by the only explanation currently plausible. This is all programming. I have discovered coding protocols. Therefore, I conclude that I am inside a simulation. In today's commercial society, we are made to believe all sorts of things that are untrue. 18 centuries ago, the social engineers of ancient Rome were no less designing and deceitful than those now operating in corporate America, our government agencies, and the media. They know that in the creation of mass deception, there is a fundamental that must be adhered to in order to be an effective deceiver. The fiction must be introduced along with a series of facts. Absorbing whole ethnic groups, foreign populations, their languages, creeds, and beliefs, the government of Rome had become too overspread, plagued by civil unrest. Though the political structure faltered and collapsed, Rome religious authorities did not fail to perceive a common thread of belief among all the diverse groups throughout their empire's vast provincial domains. In deepest Africa to the battlefields of the Germans, and from Gaul and the kingdoms of the Celts to the Western Europe to the civilizations of the Near East and abroad, all mankind knew of and feared the Phoenix. Many are the ancient chroniclers who left us records of the Phoenix. Some claim that it was a great round object that was in the heavens that drew close to the sun, darkening it, while others refer to it as a huge red star or even a fiery flaming sword in the sky. When the Phoenix appeared, it always brought earthquakes and the moon turned blood red. In fact, the Greek antiquarian Robert Graves, in his monumental book, The Greek Myths, translates Phoenix as meaning bloody red. It was this history of Phoenix disasters that the early Christian mythographers used to link fact with fiction. By the emergence of early Christianity, the knowledge of the periodicity, the timing of the Phoenix appearances was pretty much lost. The terrible disasters that all occurred 552 years apart, from the Great Flood in 2239 BC to the Ogygian Flood 552 years later in 1687 BC, and the 25-year darkness that followed and the starvation that killed the old Bronze Age civilizations, the disasters of 1135 BC and the Phoenix transit of 583 BC were remembered in a variety of ways, all the way to 31 BC when the Phoenix passed again, causing major earthquakes in Greece and Judea, and the knowledge of its periodicity was pretty much lost, but it was even recorded as a fiery red dragon over Egypt at that time. Over 140 years after the story of Jesus was alleged to have occurred, the account received an added dimension, claiming that the Phoenix appeared in the form of the darkening of the sun and earthquake at the crucifixion of Christ. By introducing an element of fiction on a background of fact, the church stole the Phoenix to authenticate their religious design. By the majority of Christian authorities, Jesus was crucified in 33 Common Era, 33 AD or Anno Domini. The earliest documents belonging to Christianity make no mention of the darkening of the sun. They do not mention an earthquake. However, in 180 CE, the 4 Gospels suddenly appeared: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Prior to the appearance of these accounts, no church fathers left any records of the sun darkening. Now, in Matthew 27, verse 45, we read, "Now from the 6th hour there was a darkness over all the land until the 9th hour." Suddenly, this is reiterated in the Gospel of Nicodemus. A terrible darkness covered the whole land when the Christ was crucified. In fact, with the appearance of the church's official version of events, the 4 Gospels, many Christian writers openly claim that at the crucifixion of Jesus, the Phoenix made an appearance. One of the most widely known and easily proven forgeries from early Christianity is called Pilate's Report to Tiberius Caesar, wherein we read, "The sun was altogether hidden, and the sky appeared dark while it was yet day. Wherefore, I suppose your excellency is not unaware that in all the world they lighted their lamps from the 6th hour unto evening. And the moon, which was like blood, did not shine all night long, although it was at the full. So dreadful were the signs that men saw, both in the heavens and on the earth, that Dionysius the Areopagite is reported to have said, either the author of nature is suffering, or the universe itself is falling apart." Unfortunately, Dionysius neither wrote nor said any such thing, nor was he the only early authority to have had their observations stolen and words added to their accounts. Church officials destroyed all known copies of earlier records to conceal their misdeeds. The Dionysius account was of a phoenix event of the past contorted to suit their purpose. The same was done by Eusebius 3 centuries after the alleged crucifixion event. Eusebius was one of the main church fathers, but he lived centuries after the events that he depicts. He wrote that a pagan historian named Phlegon of Bithynia wrote in a book called Olympiads that the sun darkened and a terrible quake transpired that destroyed the city of Nice in Bithynia. But scholars have found no trace of Phlegon. No ancient authors mention him, though they do not cite him, nor are the books called Olympiads known to the multitudes of ancient authors who would have cited them. Either Phlegon was purely of church invention 300 years after the fact, or the Phoenix event preserved by Phlegon was real, authentic account from an earlier time period not corresponding to 33 CE. Crucifixion timing, so the Olympiad text had to be destroyed, allowing Eusebius, a known forger and liar, to use the account with impunity. By adopting the Phoenix into their version of events, the church authorities gave people pause, many accepting the divinity of Jesus simply because his death was visited by the celestial and terrifying Phoenix. The history unveils how truly effective this common denominator was in bringing so many people into the Christian fold. The legend and story of the Phoenix was one of the greatest told in the ancient world simply because it was relevant to human survival. The church had stolen this concept to empower their position, knowing full well that the ideas attached to it, to the memories of the Phoenix, were of historical veracity. The Phoenix appeared to die as it collided into the sun, darkening it, casting the world in shadow much longer than an ordinary eclipse. But the sun and the Phoenix resurrected to repeat the drama all over again 552 years later. Life after death was a phoenix motif. In the archaic Egyptian city of On, also known as Anu and later by the Greeks as Heliopolis, was located the mansion of the Phoenix, where a holy relic stone called the Benben was protected, an old fragment of a meteorite. The Phoenix was known as the divine Bennu bird, and its disappearances and reappearances were linked to violent cosmic cycles and to the destruction and rebirth of world ages. An Egyptian papyrus written in Greek but dated as a copy of an older text from the time of Amenhotep reads, "For in the Typhon time the sun is veiled." This would refer to the sun darkening at the appearance of Typheon, or the Phoenix. In Egypt, the date palms were called phoenix palms. These trees held sacred to the reckoning of the times. Manly P. Hall, undisputably one of the greatest occultists who have ever lived, in his Secret Teachings of All Ages, wrote that it was the testimony of early writers that the Phoenix returned every 500 to 1,000 years. Its appearance in the sky was taken for a standard for measuring the motion of the heavenly bodies and the duration of the cycles of time. Clement, in the 2nd century Common Era, wrote that when the Phoenix appeared, the priests then inspect the registers of the dates and find that it has returned exactly as the 500th year was completed. 5 centuries, though, is wrong. By the time of early Christianity, the knowledge of the Phoenix appeared every 552 years had been completely lost. That it was known precisely in distant antiquity is proven in the predictions made by Atreus and Thales of Miletus. Stories of the Phoenix at the inception of the Christian movement were deeply embedded within the human psyche. Cycles of global disaster die hard. For this reason, the power of the early Christian gospel accounts came from its borrowed materials, the facts that were used to support the fiction. By adding the sun darkening and quake effect of Phoenix to the story of Jesus' crucifixion, the church brilliantly provided itself an historical touch to an imagined event. But this only worked because it was contrived centuries after it was supposed to have occurred. Anyone who has taken serious consideration of the alleged evidences of the gospel narratives will note that Paul nor any other New Testament writer mentioned the sun darkening or earthquake at Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels were composed over a century and a half after the time period they allege to relate. Many of the parables and sayings of Jesus were taken straight out of Buddhist and Near Eastern texts. Jesus was the last popularized version of over 24 crucified saviors. No Christian documents antedating the Gospels mention the sun darkening or quake, and the Church Fathers' writings are very, very extensive. None of the historians, naturalists, or chronographers of Jesus' day mention him or the crucifixion. No authentic records exist concerning the sun darkening or quake. Cassius Dio, Pliny the Elder, Seneca, Tacitus, even the Jewish writers Philo Judaicus and Flavius Josephus are silent on the crucifixion, darkening of the sun, and quake. We have had to put together the pieces to unravel this deceit because the hundreds, perhaps thousands of texts from antiquity stored at the Pergamon Library, the Alexandrian Library, at Carthage and abroad were purposely burned by church officials and Roman officials in a series of purges designed to empower their own version of history while removing the true records that would have exposed their schemes.
The Kali Yuga, Phoenix programming disguised by the simulacrum. The Black Age, the death goddess who represented darkness, bloodthirsty religion, and heaps of dead bodies, is depicted with 8 arms in ancient India. She is the same as the arachnid spider grandmother of ancient America and embodies the concept of the 8 kings of the Anunnaki, which were originally 7 kings whose reign began with a goddess. These 3 cultures, the Vedic, ancient American, and the Sumerian, also preserve 3 calendars that have been terribly misunderstood. These systems were apocalypse countdowns. My many other videos and published books show the truth about the Sumerian and the Mayan calendars, but the Vedic I have withheld until now. In this presentation, I will show you what not even Hindu scholars know. The Kali Yuga calendar is the most mysterious of the 3, for it contains within its structure a hidden calendrical system modeled after the destructive Phoenix phenomenon that I have released 30 videos on. In many presentations, I show how the calendars of the old world were all countdowns of days, observing not the sun, but the turnings of the stellosphere. All calendar observations were performed at night in the darkness beneath the thrones, or what the ancients called stars. This was during a world of populations that were organized into matriarchal communities beneath the vapor canopy. The Olmec, the Quiche, Maya Temple of the Cross, these calendars, like the Mayan long count, all factored days. They were structured in Bactans of 144,000 days each. I've said this many times. And the Sumerian shars were king turnings, referring to the stars revolving around the eye of the dragon, Alpha Draconis. The Vedic Kali Yuga was structured in the same way, counting only the days. All 3 systems, the Maya, the Sumerian, and the Vedic, measure a 432,000 day period, or 144,000 times 3 days. The Mayan, Olmec, Sumerian, Vedic, Egyptian, and Chinese calendars all began about 5,000 years ago at the same time during the reign of Enoch, the Enki of the Near East traditions. Though scholars are aware that the oldest timekeeping systems were stellar calendars, and although ancient writers like Eudoxus and Diodorus Siculus warn us that earlier writers corrupted days and lunations of the moon into years, there is an entirely different reason why we know that all these calendars were days. Though we know the Hindu scholars recognize the anomaly that the Kali Yuga was both a 432,000 year period and a 1200 year period, they do not know what I am about to reveal.
432,000 is simply 360 times 1200. But the one fact that unveils the truth about these calendars is that every one of these calendars began during the vapor canopy period. No sun was known to the people of this period. A violet sky held up an ocean above. It was in the book of Genesis called the firmament. There was no rain. Air pressure was different. Plants grew to astonishing sizes, packed with minerals and vitamins. The human body rapidly regenerated. At night, the vapor atmosphere saturated the ground and provided enough moisture because during the daytime, there was no sun. The sky was still dark. The vapor canopy period is why the zodiac was important. The turnings of the stars around the pole star and how the stories of a hero, Perseus, destroyed the Medusa or Kali Yuga, the personification of destruction. Until the vapor canopy is acknowledged, no theory of ancient history makes sense. The calendars, the traditions, the narratives, the monuments, and even the mechanics of the Great Flood cannot be put into appropriate context until a recognition of the vapor canopy is known and understood. Andrew Collins, Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, Robert Schoch, Michael Tellinger, Brian Forrester, David Hatcher Childress, Zechariah Sitchin, and his many copycats like Brian Carlson, they don't know this history, so they interpret the ancient texts, traditions, and monuments by modern frames of reference. The result is libraries packed with absolute bullshit. The traditions of the Dharma time has the Kali Yuga beginning at 3103 BC. Amazingly, this was the year 864 Annus Mundi, or 864 years after the 3895 BC pole shift caused by Phoenix that was so absolute in its destruction that the ancients declared that it was the beginning of a new heavens and a new earth, and counted it as year one of the pre-flood world. The Kali Yuga began the 864th year of the vapor canopy. As readers of my Anunnaki Homeworld book will recall, 864 is the number of the foundation of time as it bridges together uniformly all seconds, minutes, hours, and days, all into a unified system in the book that I show with amazing charts. It's a phenomenal number. This 3103 BC begin date for the Kali Yuga began a 792-year countdown to the flood in 2239 BC when Phoenix collapsed the vapor canopy. Now, 792 years is the periodicity of the Nemesis X object many of you call Nibiru, which returns in 2046, when the 13th Bactrian of the Mayan long count is completed. This synchronicity is harrowing and further confirmed by Hindu tradition, which claims that Brahma lives 311,040 billion human years. Now that's a real specific number, and the added zeros are common in the texts of the Hindus, the Babylonians, the Egyptians are guilty of it as well. This is because our written records were composed centuries after the technological civilizations of the vapor canopy had been lost. Just as the early Sumerians, Egyptians, Chinese, and Maya grouped their day counts into units of 360, so too was 360 days a base denominator in the Vedic system. This 31140 divided by the ancient 360 days becomes exactly 864 years, thus identifying 3103 BC as 864 Annus Mundi. You just can't make up these associations. Anybody can check the math. 864 years of 360 days each is exactly 311,040. It's not a fiction. Any calculator will verify that. It's astounding. Now, the 1656 years of the pre-flood world began and ended by Phoenix destructions, and this 1656 years is 864 plus 792 years. This links the Vedic Kali Yuga calendar to both the Phoenix and the Nemesis X object, both returning in May 2040 and November 2046. Now, 3103 BC embodies the concepts of destruction, darkness, piles of dead bodies, and religion. So we should not be surprised to discover a hidden Phoenix chronometry embedded within the Kali Yuga calendar. As most of you know, The phoenix resets, the mud floods, total destructions, and sun darkenings occur on a 138-year timeline. But the Kali Yuga date here is not on this chronology. Instead, it begins its own 138-year protocol. In the 138th year of the Kali Yuga, or 2965 BC, we find in the Genesis chronology that Adam died in this year, and in the Hebrew traditions, it claimed that when he died, the sun darkened. 966th year of the Kali Yuga, or 138 times 7, was 2137 BC, the exact year in Chronicon we have for a strange darkening of the sun recorded by the Chinese. Year 1242 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 9, is 1861 BC. The date Abram, or Brahma, and Hagar of Egypt had a son named Ishmael. Year 1380 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 10, is 1723 BC, when Ishmael died. You just can't make this stuff up. Both of them are Ishmael. This is recorded in the Secrets of Time by biblical chronologist Stephen Jones, not me. He dated both of these, not knowing anything about Phoenix. Year 1518 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 11, is 1585 BC, the year Joseph, known as Zoser in Egypt, dies. This year also concludes the history of the entire book of Genesis. Joseph was the great-grandson of Brahma, known as Abram in Genesis. Year 1656 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 12, is the epic date of 1447 BC, the exodus of Israel during an Egyptian cataclysm. This is the beginning of the fulfillment of the covenant of Brahma, called Abram in Genesis, where the Creator promised that his descendants will fill the entire earth with people. Year 2070 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 15, is 1033 BC, when the Israelites defeated the Amalekites, descended from Ishmael, and King Saul is cursed for not executing their king, Agag. In year 2484 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 18, is 619 BC, when the books of Moses were introduced to the people by the priests of Jerusalem, who falsely claimed that these were the books of antiquity, when they had just written them. Year 2622 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 19, is 481 BC, when Xerxes led the largest army ever into ancient Greece and was met at Thermopylae by 1,400 Spartans. There is an obscure tradition at this time when he marched that the sun darkened, and it wasn't caused by the moon. Eclipses were known in those days. A total war of carnage and piled up bodies occurred at this time. Year 2898 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 21, is 205 BC, when the ancient and sacred black stone of Pergamum in Turkey was brought to Rome because the Sibyls prophesied that the victory between Rome and Carthage depended on who possessed the stone. The Sibyls were an order of the ancient matriarchs from the Kali Yuga period. Year 3864 Kali Yuga, or 138 times 28, is 762 AD, the year the descendants of Ishmael under the Abbasid dynasty of the Islamic Empire relocated their capital to Baghdad in Babylonia. In the Jewish world, there was a rift in their religion that continues to this day, involving the Karaite movement. And in ancient America, the Mayan sky watchers, who were keepers of the times, assembled at the holy city of Copan to dedicate their calendar. Further, this exact year of 762 is the 6,000th year of the Anunnaki chronology that began in 5239 BC, as seen in Chronicon, a chronology of 600-year epics. In year 4416 of the Kali Yuga, 138 times 32, is the final Phoenix destruction event of this Vedic calendar, being 1314 AD, when Nemesis X object appeared as a great black darkness over Europe. It is the end of the 7 comet period over Europe. In the 138 years that follows occurs the Great Black Death that kills 1/3 of the human race. The Ottoman Empire of the Turks begins. Terrible famine in Europe. The Mongols rise to power under Timur Khan. The 100 Years' War begins between England and France. Earthquakes destroy the Pharos Lighthouse, the last of the surviving wonders of the ancient world outside of the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid is damaged as well with the casing stones. The first English Bibles are published, and Christians everywhere banish Jews from hundreds of European cities. because of their financial malpractices. Joan d'Arc is burned at the stake as the Roman Catholic Church rises to its full power. Just as the start of the Kali Yuga in 3103 BC began a 792-year countdown to the Phoenix destruction of the Great Flood, so too does 1314 AD begin a 792-year countdown to 2046, when time will collapse, according to the Mayan long counts, and the return of Nemesis X object in that same year, which in the book of Revelation is called Wormwood, which will change the 24-hour day to 16 hours and 365-day year to 240 days. This will happen when the vapor canopy returns, and this quickening of time-space will also quicken human biology to miraculous speeds. Now, I have shown in my Apex calendar presentations that many major calendars and events are encoded in the chronometry of the Great Pyramid. The Kali Yuga here is also found. The entrance to the Great Pyramid is 808 sloping inches up to the entrance from the perimeter, and the descending passage is 1,110 inches to the passage axis conjunct. This is 1,918 inches, and these translate to years of world history in this holography of coding that contains us. The entire structure has been shown in hundreds of books, videos, and articles over the past 400 years to maintain golden proportion ratios throughout, or phi, represented mathematically as 1.618. This entry of 1918 inches multiplied by 1.618 is 3103.3, the start of the Kali Yuga calendar. You can put away the idea of coincidence, because this merely begins this series of pyramid dimensions. From the end of this 1,110 inches begins 1546 inches of the ascending passage. Now, by this we arrive at 447 BC, when work began on the famous Parthenon at Athens, and when Ezra finished his composition of the Old Testament books. Further up the passage, the remaining 1814 inches gets us to 1368 AD, when the Chinese overthrow the Mongol dynasty after 400,000 Chinese drowned in disasters. This is 204 inches to the well pit axis, which gets us to 1572 AD, when a supernova appeared, visible even in daylight, predicted by Nostradamus. The same year, the Roman Catholics staged the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, killing 60,000 Protestants, stacked up bodies. And moving along, the final 330 inches to the wall of the King's Chamber lands us at 1902 AD, the last time Phoenix visited. I have 3 videos on 1902 and others that show that the 203 levels of the Great Pyramid are years counting down from 1902 to 2105 AD, that the chief cornerstone will descend and be the 204th level on the pyramid in 2106, the 204th year, which is 6,000 Annus Mundi, the 6,000th year since Phoenix started the new heavens and the new earth by a devastating pole shift. This 3103 BC Kali Yuga start date is also found descending into the pyramid rather than going up to 1902. The descending passage is 4146 inches and ends 302 inches from the central axis of the entire monument. This provides us the year 1346 AD, in the worst year of the Great Black Death Plague that killed a third of humanity.
As you know, we have all been taught that this is the geographical distribution of land masses in our world. This is the Mercator projection. There are many problems with this map, but we're not going to go into those. Flat earthers have done a phenomenal job in explaining this. I don't need to revisit it here. It's not even necessary. But this is the world that has been presented to us, and this distribution of land masses does not comport at all with the ancient historical record, and we'll get into that in this video. The vapor canopy that I have shown in prior videos and in a lot of posts in Facebook Archaics group could never exist on a world that was, if this was the true paradigm, if this was the real world, the vapor canopy wouldn't work on this model. And yet, in the historical record, we do have the presence of the vapor canopy. For those of you who don't know, in ancient times, there are descriptions of a watery atmosphere, a mesosphere that magnified the heavens at night to where stars that cannot be seen with the naked eye right now were seen then. And they are attached to zodiacal traditions and different matriarchal, basically it was the matriarchal societies back then. It was stellar worship, lunar worship. The moon was seen brilliantly in the sky. But the daytime was like a dark purple light, the sky. The sun was unknown, absolutely unknown. It wasn't until the day that the sky fell, which was the collapse of the vapor canopy, which in the biblical narrative and other ancient syllabuses, it was referred to as a flood or the great flood, or the water sun age began. To ancient American cultures, it was the birth of the sun. It started the 4 sun ages, which I have shown in other videos, were the 4 552-year periods of the Phoenix periodicity. And we'll not get into the Phoenix in this video. But the vapor canopy world, the entire scenario that is presented to us from the historical record works on a flat earth model. Look at this picture right here. Now, in the vapor canopy, as actually the 456th year of the vapor canopy, we have the year 3439 BC, and many of you are familiar with that number. You're familiar with that date from many prior presentations. This was the year of a mass destruction, and it's never really made sense on a world map that has been presented to us, but on a flat earth map, the area of destruction looks very familiar. Do you see the green ring in the center of this map? North America all the way around, all of Europe, all of Russia, the Alaska, all the entire Mediterranean, everything, the entire area. It was an impact event, and it is described in the traditions as an impact event as well. This area of mass destruction in 3439 BC, there were no pyramid building civilizations anywhere within that ring you see on that flat earth map in the center. Stone cities and architecture have been found at depths of 40 to 200 feet deep, completely buried, entombed, even whole ships. This vast destruction resulted in mass migrations away from the Americas. Which brings us to a very interesting point. The most sophisticated pyramid cities and civilizations were all in Central and South America. They were not in Sumer. As a matter of fact, Sumer, Akkad, Elam, Urartu, Hattusis, Ebla, Ugarit, all these ancient Near Eastern sites where they say civilization has begun, it's absolute BS. These were the fallback areas to survivors of a great cataclysm. This is where they had to restart everything. You can see here on this illustration that the pyramid building cities were in South America, right here, and in Central America. And we know of these civilizations, they're well documented in archaeology, but few people realize the technical sophistication of those pyramids in comparison with the crappy, poorly built pyramids of Egypt. And when I say this, I'm not referring to the Giza pyramids. I am not referring to what you see on that illustration as a white pyramid in Egypt right there. That's totally different. Even the ancient traditions say that a pyramid was built, a pillar, the axis mundi was built far away. So this vast destruction that destroyed North America and part of Central America, it's on the Anunnaki-Ner chronology. This is one of the calendrical systems for which I have revealed several videos about, showing that an ancient great year of 600 years was known to the ancients, and I also show where modern historians have done a pretty good job covering this up deliberately. For some reason, establishment historians do not want the public to know about this 600-year period. So this event happened on the Anunnaki-Ner chronology. It was an expected event that occurred. They were anticipating something to happen. They just didn't realize the magnitude. They probably didn't understand that it was going to be an impact event. So Having said that, this is the Anuna chronology chart. Well, the highlighted area is the vapor canopy period right here. But 3439 BC was when this occurred. And according to the traditions, as I've revealed and I've showed in the Jewish Haggadah and in the book of Jasher, 1/3 of the entire world's population died. And this is in the historical text concerning this event. It's called the Gihon flood. And this was 12 centuries before the flood that you're familiar about, which is the flood of Noah. While the event was on the Anunnaki-Ner chronology, 3439 BC happened to be the exact date, the very first time the Nemesis X object appears in the skies and causes a cataclysm in the historical record. Now, JasonArchaix has done a fantastic job of screwing people up royally so they totally misunderstand Sumerian chronology. The Nemesis X object appeared in 3439 BC, as many of my loyal listeners know, and it was the cause for these mass migrations of which emptied North and Central America. South America continued on, but that's another story. Now, this vapor canopy civilization in North and Central America, they're not your typical ancient civilizations that you've been brainwashed to believe in. These aren't the basic Near Eastern type civilizations we read about in the encyclopedias. We're talking about people who absolutely lost their infrastructure, but not quite their technology, not their expertise, not their arcs. Their arcs were packed with seeds, with agriculture, the sciences of agriculture, all their tools, their manufacturing, their weaponry, everything was superior. When they appeared in the New World, which was Asia, Europe, the Near East, North Africa, when they appeared there, the Neolithic survivors of the cataclysm in that part of the world were not ready for them. They saw these bearded invaders as gods. They accepted that they had fallen out of the sky, although the traditions the Sumerians left us, according to Thor Heyerdahl and several Sumerologists like Samuel Noah Kramer, they admit that the earliest Sumerian traditions were not gods coming from the skies, but the Anunnaki, which were called the Anuna, had actually arrived in fleets of ships. Sometimes they are described as arcs. Now, it was during the vapor canopy period, as you can see on this chart right here. This is a Phoenix chart, and it's incomplete. I have some more Phoenix episodes to add to this chart, but it serves its purpose. But it was during the 1656 years of the pre-flood world, which was the vapor canopy world, that this occurred. These ancient Americans, the Anuna, they had vehicles. They had technological sophistication for hypersonic boring, for levitation of large stones, rocks, especially if they're of a crystalline structure. They drove vehicles that left tracks that have still been seen today. It's we're not talking about aliens and an alien civilization that came to Earth and did all these things. We're talking about humans that were here, that were technologically advanced. Like I tell you guys all the time, it only takes us 200 years. Horse and buggy to Hadron Collider takes 200 years. And yet we're talking about, in this video, 57 centuries of history. We've been technologically advanced quite a few times. The entire history of the Anunnaki is compressed. JasonArchaix inflated it into hundreds of thousands of years, but I have shown you guys proof after proof after proof from the scholar Eudoxus and Diodorus Siculus and many others that the ancients had no concept of years. Even the Mayan Popol Vuh, Kilam Balam, all these ancient texts, the Oralind manuscript, there's so many, even the Epic of Gilgamesh, everything was focused on days. Years did not matter under a vapor canopy because there were no seasons. And this is what we're going to get into, these vapor canopy calendrics and how they did not originate in Sumer and Akkad in the Near East, Babylonia. They did not originate there at all, because these new peoples, They came from the Americas and they brought their calendars with them. And this is where the Olmec calendar came from. This is where the Vedic calendar came from. This is where the Mayan calendar came from. This is where the Sumerian calendar came from. This is why every single one of them are divisible by 360, because they counted days. This is why they were all measurable in cycles and epicycles. These are vapor canopy calendars that counted down to the next major cataclysm that was going to occur during a vapor canopy. Here is a recent chart that I had published in another video that shows basically the synchronicity between 4 ancient calendrical systems that most of the world had forgotten about. I had put them back together. They are supported by hundreds of data points. So anyway, having said that, this chart right here is basically a synthetic. It shows the history of the world in these 4 calendars. Although I've studied 41 different calendrical systems, and I have videos about most of them, and I have more to reveal, this one chart shows 4 different calendrical systems, and how these are basically cataclysm protocols. The lit area, this is the vapor canopy world history right here. This is when, well, the Anunnaki were technologically advanced. This is when the whole entire Anunnaki history, every single thing we know about, all the hundreds of thousands of references in Near Eastern texts, from the libraries of Nippur, and the libraries of Uruk, and the libraries of Ashurbanipal, all the records that have been found in Ebla, everything mentioning these figures in ancient history, that entire history is all right here in this area. It's during the vapor canopy. All the beginning dates for all the ancient calendars that we're familiar with was all during the vapor canopy, when the sun was unknown, and in the daytime the sky was a purple type light. The vapor canopy was a mesosphere. This is a water table in the sky that diffused the sun's light, so you couldn't see a ball. You couldn't see. All it did was just light the whole sky up with an ambient light. Vapor canopy physics is quite known into science. We have a sister world you know of as Venus. Venus today has a vapor canopy. It may not be quite like the one that I am describing now, but the creation counts for civilizations all around the world in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th millennium BC all describe the same thing. This vapor canopy, this ocean in the sky, and that it did not rain. There were no tornadoes. There were no windstorms. There was no thunderstorms. There were no rainbows. None of that existed under the vapor canopy. Every night, the vapor canopy collapsed, and the extra humidity created pools of water on the ground, lush vegetation. Amphibians and reptiles and plants grew to astonishing sizes. Ambient radiation also caused humans and animals, flora and fauna, all grew to astonishing sizes. And the megafauna all existed during the vapor canopy period. So the world is destroyed, 3439 BC, this terrible omen, this doom shape in the sky, the Nemesis X object. 1/3 of the entire world's population is killed. Mass migrations, survivors in fleets, 2 separate fleets that we know of, arrive to a place called Dillman, set up like a base, and then send fleets further of just nothing but males. It appears that there was 50 men to a ship, and they had awesome weapons. They had armor. They were bearded, and this shocked the natives in the Near East, because at the time they had no hair on their faces. They were smooth-skinned, olive-toned skin, almond eyes. They prided themselves, calling themselves the black-headed people, and they were of small stature. And when the Anunnaki arrived, these tall, bearded, weaponized individuals, they were regarded as gods. And they set up their cities. They set up their civilization. This is the beginning of Sumer, and how they basically created their own civilization right there in the middle of the Ubaid, an older civilization under the matriarchy. So the Anunnaki enter the historical record but they've got everything. They brought their infrastructure with them. The locals were astonished. They had tractors, they had vehicles, they had flying apparatus, they had tablets that they carried, and they used those tablets to command different things to move. These were called Mes in Sumerian. It's just M-E. They held these tablets, and the locals, they thought this was incredible that they could hold these tablets and convey knowledge, convey wisdom. They could make things happen. They were like gods. It was magical. But it was no different than right now in America. I can hold an Android Tab 6 tablet and I can command it through apps to do all kinds of things. I can even remote control whatever it's synced to through Bluetooth. So this is how Sumer was founded, and it happened after this major impact event, 3439 BC. Now, this is where things get interesting, because about a century later, one of the most sophisticated calendars in the world is begun. 3113 BC, the Mayan long count calendar is initiated. But we have, in the biblical narrative, Enoch is alive at this time period when the Mayan long count begins, which is only 100 and something years after the Anuna appeared. And Genesis talks about this as well. Now, a lot of people they buy into the Christian interpretation, which is propagated through Jewish, basically, reinterpretation of ancient records. And Genesis is very specific. It says that the sons of God came unto the daughters of men and took all that they wanted, and they begat sons, and these became mighty men of renown. It's Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. I can't remember the exact wording, but there's no reference anywhere in there that these were how hybrids and demons and nefarious creatures were created. No, it doesn't say that anywhere in there. It says that the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they begat sons. Now, when you read Jewish writings, it goes into a lot of detail about how evil and iniquitous and how it is, but that's not what the historical record shows. We have a situation that's recorded in Genesis of the Anuna coming in, and they are taking the females of the locals, the Ubaids, and they are creating an entire new race. It may have been that only males survived this great cataclysm. These were military ships that showed up. And this is why all these ancient traditions, you always had this great bearded leader who jumped off a ship and he was followed by 50 men. This was an old Bronze Age institution. This, like Jason and his 50 Argonauts. And what really can't be ignored in history is that right after this cataclysm, these fleets show up of Anuna. They're building a whole new infrastructure. They're creating the Sumerian civilization. And the Sumerians started with the sexagesimal system. They started with a really advanced cosmology. Their mathematics was precise. And at the same time in history, almost all at the same time, the Maya Isha Temple of the Cross calendar begins. The Mayan long count calendar begins. The Egyptian long chronology begins. They all used the day in their system of counting. They all appeared at the exact same time. And these calendars, as I've shown in my Anuna files, are very, very specific about, they are not calendars in the sense of like harvest calendars, like the old Assyrian calendar almanacs, where they're just when to plant your corn and when. These are apocalypse calendars. These are countdowns to definitive things that are going to happen in the far future. The Mayan long count, the Olmec calendars, they're attached to systems of prophecies. Well, this tells me that the civilization that implemented these was still technologically advanced. Those Mes that are on the Sumerian traditions, those tablets that they were carrying, were actually computer devices, because every bit of this would have had to have been programmed. This is programming that we're looking at. The ancient Anuna were technologically sophisticated. Yes, they lost their infrastructure, but they probably still had mobile battery units and mobile units by which they use their technology. And technology is exactly what is being described in many of the older Sumerian traditions. It's the frames of reference that they didn't have. We also have to take in consideration that there were no written records kept at this time. The reason written records were not kept until later was because the only people that needed to read and write were those who were ruling, and they obviously had some type of technology. They had these tablets by which they could communicate, by which they did, and they had all their data stored that way. Whatever happened later and their technology ceased to operate, it ceased to work, whatever happened later, the Sumerians, 200 years later, were now making tablets out of clay,